Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us today. My name is Madeline Webster. I work in the education program at the National Conference of State Legislatures. And today we're very lucky to be joined by the Early Care and Education team at the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development to dive deeply into what early learning looks like around the world. So this webinar is part of a series that we are doing diving into certain aspects of NCSL's 2016 report, No Time to Lose, How to Build a World-Class Education System State by State. In that report, we found that top-performing countries have a set of 4 elements in common, including that children come to school ready to learn and are given extra support extra support is given to struggling students throughout the early years and throughout school. So we wanted to learn more about what that looked like in top-performing countries. So we reached out to the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, or the OECD, to talk us through some of their research, some of their big annual reports, and some of the analysis that they've been doing about how top-performing countries structure their early learning systems. So on the webinar today, we have Rowena Fair, a senior analyst with the OECD, Elizabeth Shuey, an analyst with the OECD, and Arno Engel. So they've got a couple of great presentations for us. We'll have about 40 minutes of presentation, and then there will be lots of time for question and answers. If you want to access the PowerPoint itself, you can download a PDF straight out of the webinar sort of system in front of you. If you've got a question about that, just pop it into the chat box. If you have any other questions for the speakers or for me at NCSL, again, just pop that into the chat box, and we'll make sure to answer as many of them as possible. So with that, I'm going to hand it over to Rowena Fair. Thanks so much, OECD.
Thank you very much. Hello, everyone. It's a great pleasure to be able to talk to you today, and we're very much looking forward to both sharing some of our work with you, but also the discussion. So I will start off. As Maddie said, my name is Rowena Fair. I'm a project leader, senior analyst here at the OECD Education Directorate, and I'm leading a new study that the OECD is doing on children's early learning and well-being. So I've got some slides here. They will move through reasonably rapidly, but my intention is to give you an overview of the study, and then hopefully there's time for discussion. So this study was initiated by OECD countries, including the US. There was increasing focus on the importance of children's early learning, concerns about, actually, I wish I could, slow this down? Yeah, I think we could. Sorry people, I just realised I've got a time on this presentation, and it's far too fast for this discussion, so I'm just asking one of my colleagues to see if we can slow that down. But I'll just talk about the main points that I wanted to cover, which are countries asked the OECD to look at children's early learning outcomes with a view to better understanding how their ECC systems were contributing, supporting children to be developmentally on track, I suppose is a term. The term school ready is quite positive in some countries. In other countries, it suggests a kind of schoolification of those first few years. What countries were interested in is how do we know that our ECC systems are preparing children well, but also giving them positive experiences in those critical years. The evidence is much clearer, much more compelling now that children's development in those early years is a strong predictor of their well-being, their progress in their later years, and including through to their adult outcomes, both in an education domain, whether they're successful at school and beyond, but also the extent to which they are, essentially happy, healthy, and well-adjusted citizens. So we can see correlations between that early development, both in the social emotional development and in their cognitive skills. Now, a number of countries have been increasing their provision of ECC over the last 20 to 30 years, and some countries have close to universal provision. The US is not one of those, but those countries that had got close to universal provision were interested in whether the type of provision they'd put in place were benefiting all children, such as children from disadvantaged families, migrant children, children from ethnic minorities, and so on. Other countries that had more modest levels of take-up of ECC and who were looking to grow provision and participation rates were interested in having more information about how well their ECC systems were performing and to better enable them to invest in those areas that were going to support children best. There was a particular interest in equity. There's a view that if you get ECC right, that can go a long way to levelling the playing ground for children. If children from disadvantaged homes have strong positive experiences in early childhood education and care, that can put them on a positive path to have a good chance at doing well in education. But some countries were concerned that the ECC that they had put in place didn't appear to be having an impact at a system level. So they had questions about, well, you know, our ECC systems might be good overall, but are they really, how useful are they for children from a diverse set of backgrounds? So countries asked the OECD to look at this issue and see what we could do. So we have been developing this study, and it will enable countries to not only see how well children are prepared or developing in their own countries, but they'll have a common framework for understanding and comparing themselves to early learning outcomes in other countries. So they'll be able to look at if other countries, for example, are better able to develop children's language skills, self-regulation skills, social and emotional skills. They'll be able to look at what are those other countries doing and what might we learn from the successes of those countries. It also provides a benchmark so that you can track your progress over time as you try to put in place improvements. And the study will identify at a high level those policies and practices which tend to help or tend to hinder early learning. So the objectives of the study are to help countries to help improve their systems and provision to support all children to be developmentally on track in their learning and to have a more equitable chance of success. So the point of assessment is 5 years of age. That was chosen after quite some debate and consideration amongst countries. It is at a point where children have either just left ECC or are transitioning from early childhood provision into the schooling system. So it's kind of a critical point, and the idea being that both you'd have some measure of how those first 5 years had helped or not helped to prepare children, but also at 5 years old, there's still a lot of opportunity for children that aren't on track or are facing challenges. If there are systemic issues that are not being addressed at age 5, there are still things that early schooling systems can do to address gaps or whatever. So it would also influence and help position those early schooling years. We were interested in both cognitive development and social emotional development. We did in preparing for the study, we did a synthesis of longitudinal studies that showed us what types of early learning were most predictive of children's later success. And as I said at the beginning, we're interested in children's success not only in terms of education and academic fields, but also how well they fared in terms of their health outcomes, both physical health and mental health, but also their sense of life satisfaction, their ability to get along with people, to be employed, to continue to be employable, work as entrepreneurs, participate as citizens, both in terms of civic engagement, voting patterns, working as volunteers. So a very holistic approach. We were very conscious that in working with 5-year-olds that the study was going to need to be designed and implemented in a way that is different from the studies that we normally undertake. Most of the people that are involved in our direct assessments are much older, so they can speak for themselves, and with adults and 15-year-olds and PISA, it's a much more straightforward process. So we needed to make sure that the experience of participating in the study was a positive one for children, that we didn't want them at all to feel tested. We wanted to ensure that the process itself was enjoyable, that children were happy to do it, and we didn't. The study is about child wellbeing, so it was critical that children's wellbeing is enhanced, or certainly not harmed in any way. But of course, to undertake these kinds of studies, they are complex and they involve a lot of different resources. We're conscious that while some of our member countries can afford costly studies, some of our countries cannot, but still have an interest in this area of children's development. So we wanted to develop a model that was both thorough, that would to ensure that we're producing information that is robust and valid, reliable, but in a way that was not going to be prohibitively expensive for most countries to participate in. We are well aware that children's early learning and development is primarily determined by their families, the homes that they grow up in. So a good part of the study is focused on getting a measure of what we call the home learning environment. We know that even in poor homes, where families undertake learning-rich activities with their children, that engage with their children, that they can provide very positive, very strong home learning environments. So we have a measure of that. We also look at the family's context, so in terms of socio-economic status, the education levels of the parents, their income levels, the community, type of community they live in, both in terms of the sort of socio-economic indicators, but also urban, rural, and so on. And then we look at the early childhood education histories of the children, the different types of early childhood provision that they participated in, the duration of that, the continuity of that, and the intensity, whether it was, for full-time, part-time, and so on. We also look at the individual characteristics of the children themselves, obviously gender, ethnicity, whether this is relevant there, whether they have a migrant background or not, whether they have special education needs, whether they have any other challenges or attributes that we can differentiate. And then we look at their learning outcomes, and we look at that from, there are actually 4 or 5, actually, I suppose, sources of information. And the first one is from the child himself or herself. So we do a direct assessment, and we do it on tablet. The child has a tablet in front of her or him. They have trained study administrators sitting beside them to help them to get the hang of the tablet. Our 5-year-olds, we've been through the field test, our 5-year-olds have no difficulty at all in undertaking the activities, the games on the tablet. Even those children that don't have regular access to devices or who haven't actually touched a tablet before, it's very intuitive. And in fact, the children that have the most access to devices actually don't appear to do as well as those that have moderate or low access to devices. So what the assessment is over 2 days. On the first day, there are 2 domains are assessed, and the child has the tablet, and there are a couple of characters. You may have seen them on the slides that whip through very quickly. I apologise for that, but the 2 main characters are Tom and Mia. Their faces and the colour of their skin changes a little bit, and actually the names change a little bit depending on the country that the study is run on. But Tom and Mia talk to the child and lead the child through a series of activities and games, and the child touches things. There's no reading or writing at all. It's really not necessary for the child to read, print, or to write anything. So Tom and Mia talk to the child engages, asks the child to do things, and the child moves things around on the tablet and comes up with answers and so on. And the feedback from the children, it was tested a lot with the children. The children love the format. They find it very easy. They think it's fun. And, it's the kinds of age-appropriate games that children are used to engaging in. So we have the direct assessment on the tablet over the course of 2 days. Each domain, there are 4 domains, and each of them is no more than 15 minutes. Some children can finish in about 10, some take about 15 minutes. So the domains are language, so it's language comprehension, vocabulary. As I say, there's no reading or writing. Numeracy, this is early numeracy, emerging numeracy concepts, and then self-regulation. And then there is also a very innovative domain on children's empathy, and that's the extent to which children can identify, recognise, name, and empathise with feelings of other children. So those are the 4 domains. So we get a direct assessment from the child. We also get feedback on the child's cognitive and social emotional skills from their parents, the people who know the children best, and from their teachers, the teacher who knows the child best, and then the trained study administrators. And most of these are trained teachers who have been specifically recruited and trained to administer the study. They spend, over the course of the 2 days, they spend at least an hour and sometimes more with the child, and they make some comments too about how the child's disposition and how the child found the activity, so they can provide us with some, and they do provide us with some very valuable information. And then our last source of information is actually from the child himself or herself. The administrator, at the end of the exercise, the administrator asks the child some questions about what they enjoy most, just a few questions about their preferences, how they find life at school or ECC, their friends, and so we get verbatim feedback from the children. So we have those 5 sources of information, and that's probably enough. So where we are at the moment is we've completed the field test, and we've made a few revisions to the study, and we're about to go into the main data collection at the end of this year. And the US is a participant in the study, so yeah, we're very pleased to have the US involved. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Rowena. I just wanted to update everybody. We are working on getting the slides fixed. We're not exactly sure what's going on. I think for the second half of the presentation, there isn't a timer, so we should be in better shape. But before we let you go, Rowena, I did want to address a couple of the questions that some members had during your presentation. And this is a question that we get frequently. What does early learning look like in top-performing countries before children get to the first day of school, or sort of in that birth through 5 space?
How do we define what is the type? So the children that are assessed are in a regulated setting. So in the US, it's kindergarten. So your 5-year-olds are in kindergarten. The ones that are in the study. In terms of the types of ECC that we ask about, we ask the full range that are operating in your country. So the definitions come from each country, so it's kind of what the definition makes sense to you. Am I understanding your question correctly?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think one of the big differences when we have conversations about early learning in the U.S. and early learning in other countries is that top-performing countries sort of think about the 0 through 5 years a little differently than we do in the U.S. And so I think when our members are starting to think about how to design early learning systems, they have lots of questions about how they might structure those first 5 years, similarly to how top-performing countries do so. But I think you got to some of that.
I mean, we're asking about the child's experience from 0 to 5, so for each year prior to the assessment. So at the point of the assessment, the child is in a regulated setting. But we do have children who have been in no form of ECC or daycare or any other kind, anything that you would describe, and some have been in informal care, and we record that. But it is a mixture. Yeah,
that's helpful. I think that's what we were looking for. Thank you. So I think we're ready to move on to the second half of the presentation. For the folks at OECD, I'm looking at the slide that says starting strong. Is that what you're seeing?
Yes, that is.
Perfect. Okay. Well, then you should be able to proceed through the slides normally.
Great. Thank you. So this is Elizabeth Chewy, and I will be talking to you a little bit more about some of these system-level questions that we look at here at OECD, and I'm joined here by my colleague Arno Engel, and this is really a joint presentation, even though you'll be hearing my voice. So to start with, I just wanted to mention some of the access issues that we see in early care and education across OECD countries and partner countries. So I'll be talking more about the systems, but I wanted to recognize first that the people who are engaged in those systems is a really important component to understand. So this chart is arranged by the percentage of disadvantaged students who report participating in early care and education settings. And what we see is that across the board, there's a difference between the more advantaged and less advantaged students, such that those students who are coming from households where they might need these experiences the most are actually the least likely to get them. And we can see that in the United States as well, which is coming in on the right side of the chart, above the OECD average there, or below in terms of the number of disadvantaged children who are participating in early care and education. Okay, and so this next chart is looking at the public investment in early care and education, which, again, if we're thinking about equity in terms of who's accessing these systems, the public investment ideally is helping mitigate some of that disparity. And what we see here is that most OECD countries do make substantial public investments in these early care and education systems, especially in pre-primary education. And increasingly, we're seeing that parent fees are publicly subsidized in a number of countries as well. So with those sorts of pieces of data as backdrop, I'll move next to talk a little bit about what do we mean when we talk about quality in early childhood education and care settings. So in this diagram, we have children nested in the middle. They are the focal point, and they are inside these other systems around them. And most close to them, we have process quality. So this refers to the types of everyday experiences and involvement in social, emotional, physical, instructional aspects of their interactions in their classes or playrooms. So things like interactions with the staff there, but also interactions with other children. And then those proximal processes are also embedded inside this idea of structural quality, which is usually captured as more distal indicators that can capture the physical, the human, and material resources available in the setting. So here, these are things that are more easily regulated usually, so they're often a focus of policy studies. And they can include things like child-to-staff ratios and staff qualifications. So these two aspects of quality, structural and process, are very important for the rest of what I'll be talking about. So I wanted to make sure that distinction was in your mind. So with that, what can policy do to support these different aspects of quality? And we have been doing quite a bit of work to look at that. So we've identified 5 levers in our publication, Starting Strong 3, 5 policy levers that can be used to improve quality at both structural and process levels. So those are data and monitoring, workforce development and working conditions, standards and governance, curriculum and pedagogy, and engaging families and communities. So those first 3 that I mentioned were a big focus of a report that we released recently, Engaging Young Children, which is a literature review and meta-analysis of studies on quality in ECEC settings. And then the curriculum and pedagogy and engaging families and communities will be delving further into in the next step of our project on quality beyond regulations, which is ongoing at the moment, and I'll give you more information towards the end of the presentation. So the important point to take home from what we've learned from the work we've done so far is really that interactions matter and that staff are at the center of efforts to promote children's development. And I think when I say that, it sounds a little bit obvious, but it's not necessarily a focus of policy and thinking about how we can improve children's experiences and support their development. So more specifically, what are we talking about here when we're saying that interactions matter? This chart comes out of our recent publication on engaging young children, and it's a representation of the data from the meta-analysis. So that's a synthesis of findings across numerous research studies. And what we see is the blue bubbles are represent process quality, the white bubbles represent structural quality, and the line in the middle suggests that there's not much of an association with child outcomes. So the bubbles that are above the line are showing a positive association. The bubbles below the line are showing a negative association. So we see that warm and responsive relationships and less conflict and permissiveness in the classrooms are associated with better literacy and numeracy skills and also better behavior and social skills. And then we also see that these aspects of structural quality that we regulate generally are not really associated with children's outcomes. But when we then look at the things that support both staff-child interactions and child development, we do see that there's a number of aspects of structural quality that are important for supporting that process quality, the staff-child interaction. So I'll talk about these in a little bit more detail, but I want to highlight here that our findings show that higher pre-service qualifications do support process quality, so staff are more likely to engage in those warm and responsive relationships with children when they have received training in early childhood care and education. In-service training is one of the most important things that we found in the report, and that's associated with both process quality and also directly with children's outcomes. And then we find that lower children to staff ratios are also associated with more positive interactions and accountability systems such as quality rating and improvement systems, or QRAS, also appear to be related to positive staff-child interactions. So I'll dig a little bit more into this in-service training component since we found that that one was so important. So here, this is a table that shows different types of support countries are providing for in-service training or professional development to the teachers who are serving young children. And then within countries, we're also showing there's a difference between childcare, which is generally for children birth to about age 3, versus preschool, which is generally serving children ages 3 to 5. So in addition to the variability within countries, I think it's important to note from this chart that in that last column about higher salary and promotion potential, that that's not necessarily something that's linked to staff engaging in training and professional development. So this idea of valuing our workforce and considering what we would expect in other professions to get out of increasing our qualifications or going through continuous learning would hopefully be some sort of career trajectory, and that's not necessarily something that we're seeing in many countries. So I do want to highlight a few policy strategies to support in-service training. Specifically in New Zealand, they have a center-funded ongoing training that focuses on curriculum implementation, assessment for learning, and strengthening teaching practices. And this is important that these are areas of focus because the literature is also showing that the content of the in-service training really matters. And things that are focused specifically on child development as well as on collaboration and leadership within centers or schools is more likely to promote these positive interactions between staff and children. So in New Zealand, the system actually emerged from a reduction in funding. So part of why I wanted to highlight this, it's not always policy decisions are clearly made in the context of restricted budgets. And in this case, what New Zealand did was to build a more collaborative approach around professional development and ensuring that they're prioritizing certain communities, so particularly disadvantaged communities and those with large numbers of Indigenous children. Another example of supporting in-service training is from Sweden, where they have a program called the Boost for Preschool, which funded thousands of ECEC staff to take education courses. Again, these were particularly focused, in this case, on children's linguistic and math development, as well as on evaluation of preschool activities. And I'll talk more about evaluation as a piece of monitoring in a few more minutes. The interesting part about this program in Sweden was that as staff were participating in these courses, they were able to keep 80% of their salaries, and this was co-funded through the government as well as the preschools. In another approach to supporting ECEC staff through training, British Columbia and Canada had revised their licensing standards so that all adults working in early childhood settings have to fulfill specific course requirements. So again, this is moving away from an approach where any sort of early childhood training will count towards these requirements, or in many cases, we see standards that say ECEC or related content. So here we're moving towards specific content. But in this case, the course requirements were drawn from existing training programs, so there wasn't a need to redesign the entire higher education system, but just an integration across and a higher emphasis on these specific content areas. And this is also linked into efforts in the provinces to promote labor market mobility. So coming back to this idea around child-staff ratios, the chart here shows the ratios across quite a few OECD countries, and you can see that there's a good bit of variability there. and also that there's quite a lot of missing data when we're talking about the ratios for the youngest children. So part of what the OECD is working on is also improving the data that's collected so that we have international comparisons and reliable data for our youngest children as well as for pre-primary education. And I think an interesting policy example to highlight here, because we know that ratios are a driver of cost in early care and education settings. In England, they mandate the ratios related to staff qualifications. So the ratios need to be smaller in settings with less qualified staff, but are allowed to be a little bit more permissive when the staff are more highly qualified. So next, I'll turn to this idea of monitoring, which relates to the QRIS system. So monitoring can mean quite a lot of things, and there are two primary purposes that we've identified. One is accountability and compliance, the other being a quality improvement and continuous learning process. And those two goals overlap quite a bit, but they also have different approaches associated with them. So typically accountability and compliance will come from an external body outside of the early care and education setting, and it's also typically done instantly. So somewhere between every 1 and 3 years, the center may be inspected to ensure that it's complying with minimum standards such as ratios and teacher education. On the other hand, for quality improvement learning processes, the monitoring can be done internally, and in that way can have a much higher frequency or be continuous. So an important thing to consider here, though, is that staff, to promote quality improvement, staff really needs to feel that that is the goal of the monitoring and that there's not a punitive purpose for either centers or for teachers themselves, to have that kind of trust that practices can be developed and teachers can be part of a learning community. So a few examples of where monitoring has been used as a tool for improvement. The first one is from Berlin in Germany, where they engage external evaluators to provide settings with feedback on pedagogical processes, organization, and cooperation among staff, as well as with parents. And then these reports are done through observations as well as interviews and reviews of documents, and the perspectives of EC providers are taken into account, as well as those of parents. So these assessments are required, and after the data are analyzed, the providers and the team of practitioners receive feedback in a face-to-face format, as well as a written evaluation of the findings. And the report statements indicate areas where quality has been achieved, as well as areas where improvement is needed, and gives concrete recommendations for next steps. Similarly, in Korea, they used a form of evaluation that encompasses feedback from multiple stakeholders. So the teacher competence evaluation is based largely on a teacher self-assessment. The teachers can engage with that in an ongoing way, and the idea is that they're looking for ways to improve their pedagogy on an ongoing process. Parents are also randomly selected to participate in a satisfaction survey every year, so that their voices are included in understanding what things are working and what things aren't. And then these strategies are complemented by external monitoring that's done somewhat less frequently. So those are our main findings from this Engaging Young Children report, but we know from our other work that promoting high-quality ECEC is not enough, and that the transition to primary school is also crucial to sustain the benefits of participating in high-quality early education settings. So this is something that's becoming increasingly common across OECD countries, is an alignment of curriculum between pre-primary and primary levels. So you see here that 76% of the jurisdictions who participated in our Starting Strong 4 research reported having these sorts of aligned curricula. And then here are two more specific examples for you. So in Norway, head teachers in both early childhood settings and primary schools are assigned responsibility for ensuring cooperation between institutions so that it's not simply a matter of the early childhood setting conforming or preparing children to transition into the primary school, but it's also an issue of the primary school preparing itself to accept the children who are coming through the ECEC system and working with those teachers and those families. In Wales, in the UK, increasingly they are co-locating early childhood services and even maternity services in primary schools to start making those links more concrete and coherent. And they have an aligned assessment for children ages 0 to 7, and these assessment results can be shared across the services that families are receiving. So not only education and early childhood services, but other health and social services as well. So that's a very brief summary of some of our previous work on strong early childhood setting practices and system practices. But we know that there's still a lot that we need to know about early childhood care and education, especially around quality and how to promote that. So on this slide, we've identified a few of the knowledge gaps as well as outlined some next steps that we have here at the OECD. So we think that, first of all, we definitely need a more fine-grained approach on curriculum and monitoring related to curriculum and pedagogy. We also need evidence to understand the relationships between certain structural features and their combined effects on process quality. We also see that evidence is lacking for a complete understanding of how structural characteristics relate to children's experiences with their peers in particular, as well as interactions that staff establish with other staff and that children's parents and guardians have with the ECEC community. So finally, further studies of early childhood quality for infants and toddlers are necessary, as most of the research we've reviewed has focused on the older pre-primary age. So those pieces we are working on addressing through two parts of work. The first is a policy review called Quality Beyond Regulations, where we're really delving further into these questions around quality, particularly process quality. And then the second piece is our Telus Starting Strong survey. So this survey is aligned with the Telus survey, which is of teachers in primary and secondary schools, but we're running it for the first time right now in early childhood settings. And then, of course, we need to better understand children's outcomes in these various systems, and that is where the International Early Learning and Child Wellbeing Study that Rowena mentioned is fitting into this bigger picture. So I'll give you a little bit more information on the policy review and the Starting Strong survey. Our policy review is very much underway right now. So the first piece was the Engaging Young Children report, and the next piece, our phase 2, will take place through 2020, addressing the question of what are good examples of policy interventions that have enhanced process quality and child development. So I understand that was a primary driving question that you had for us, and I hope that we've been able to share a few bits of information, but we definitely see this as an ongoing area of work, and we'll be focusing on curriculum and pedagogy as well as workforce development with a cross-cutting focus on family and community engagement in early childhood settings. And we are working closely with a number of countries on this, including several Canadian provinces, and still very much open to working with additional countries on this project. And the Telus Starting Strong Survey, or 3S as we call it, I won't walk through everything on this slide, but just to highlight for you that the guiding principles of this are rooted in looking at staff-child interactions, center characteristics, and leader and staff characteristics, all within a lens of equity and diversity in the child group within early childhood settings, as a mechanism to enhance the overall quality of the workforce and understand what works for young children. So this main survey is currently being fielded in 9 countries, and we expect our first report out next fall in October 2019, and we're already beginning to plan for a next round of data collection in 2024. So that was all of the slides, and we are very happy to be in touch with you. If you have any questions or want to follow up, our website is there, and you can email me and Arno and the rest of our team at either of these addresses. If you have general questions, the ecec@oecd.org is great, and if you're particularly interested in the 3S survey, you can email us specifically there as well. So thank you very much for the opportunity to speak with you.
Great. Thank you so much, Elizabeth. So we've got about 10 more minutes to answer questions. I just want to remind any audience participants that you're welcome to type questions into the chat box in the webinar sort of application in front of you. We do have one sort of bigger question that I do want to talk about with you, Elizabeth. So one of the things that we look at when we think about early learning and early learning interventions in the U.S. are wraparound services. And when I say that, I mean things like embedding health services, mental health services, even like 2-generation or services that help parents in early learning systems or in early learning schools or buildings. Do you see anything like that in any of the other top performing countries? And I guess just from the research that you've done and what you know about early learning in top performing countries, what do you think about wraparound services as a policy idea in general?
I will give that a shot, and I'll let Arno jump in if you'd like to add anything, or Rowena. But you know, in general, I think some of the examples that I've shared suggest that those ideas are very promising in early childhood settings. So, for example, in Wales, where there's a lot of coordination among services, or in settings where early childhood is being directly connected to primary school is not quite the same as wraparound services, but certainly the idea is similar and seems to be very promising in terms of supporting families. This is definitely an area where we are looking to focus in this next bit of our policy review on quality beyond regulations, is this family and community engagement and better understanding how that fits into the broader picture of quality.
I mean, just to add to that, I think it's very much what Elizabeth was saying, like, it hasn't been like the focus of our work, but it's very clear that also when we look at previous work done by the OECD, for instance, on the education of migrant children, we see that having what we call like a one-stop shop, where, for instance, there might be job counseling for parents, health provision, or other access to social services in one place, can be facilitate both access, but also like the sort of support to the home learning environment provided in those centers. We know that, for instance, in England, there have been what's called, I think,
Short Start.
Yes. Yeah, and also like in Austria, for instance, there's been some work on providing more like job counseling to migrant children and parents, and so there's a lot of work around that in many countries. We know that, for instance, in Norway, they have what they call open kindergartens, where basically parents can like drop in at any time, so it can be a way also to lower the barrier to actually connect like state service. And I mean, this is also like a big component, as far as I know, of many U.S. initiatives like Head Start, that is not only focused on preschool provision.
And some of the services to the very young children are very much wraparound, or certainly connect families to other services. So these are, you know, in the 0 to 2 sort of support that's provided through families and often in the family home itself.
Great, thank you. I think that's really helpful. Just while we're waiting for, it looks like a couple more questions are coming in. I had a question of my own. And so we talked a lot about educator workforce, especially in those early learning years, and we know that having a really strong educator, before the age of 8 is really important to create the brain structure and the brain architecture for later success in learning in school. I guess I'm wondering how top-performing countries or just countries around the world sort of integrate child development science and research and like development in that field into curriculum and pedagogy and early educator workforce training. I know that the qualifications vary greatly across the states in the U.S., and I guess I'm just wondering how top-performing countries approach that.
I think that's a really interesting question, and definitely, again, one where we need more information at this point. But, I think we're seeing that there's this important link between staff training and their interactions with children in the classroom. But that's not to say that all training is created equal, and I think that's showing up, again, in the in-service training findings where it really matters that there's a focus on specific aspects of child development to be promoting those sorts of interactions that matter for children. So in terms of what other countries are doing, I'm trying to think of some good examples.
Well, I think kind of trend-wise, what you can see is that the qualifications for people who work with children in the early years is increasing. So it's becoming more, more professionalised, if you like. And as Elizabeth said, it depends what those qualifications are and how well aligned they are to the practices, the pedagogical practices that you want those early years educators to be carrying out.
I think one thing that comes out very strongly from the literature, and that Elizabeth was including that in her presentation, is that the content, so it doesn't only matter like the level, but really that we see that the effects are show that, for instance, some practical component matters, that having an understanding of how child development works matters, and that those, for instance, that are able to understand child development are also better able to facilitate the transition across different levels because they understand where children are at, more or less, at a specific stage. And I think kind of Sweden has put a lot of thought into developing appropriate pre and in-service training. We haven't done any thorough analysis, as Elizabeth was saying, that's kind of lies ahead of us to better understand actually the content of pre and in-service training across countries, but very clearly that an understanding of how children learn and develop is the crucial cornerstone. We also know that it doesn't mean that all staff members need to be have a bachelor's or master's degree. We know from the EPSI study in the UK and England that there's kind of a spillover effect. So if you have one person in the class or playroom who has a high level of qualification, they tend to pull up the practice, the quality of the practice of the other people working with him or her.
You were asking a question about what do high-performing systems do, and one thing, we don't have a lot of, we're still developing evidence base on this, but one thing that we're pretty confident about in terms of child outcomes is that duration matters, that children participating, obviously, high quality is critical, but children participating for 2 to 3 years of high-quality early childhood education and care seems to be optimal. Based on the data that we have at the moment, none of it's perfect, but that seems to certainly be more positive than having no participation, which you would expect, hopefully. But also there is a positive impact between only 1 year and going to 2 years. Whereas after 3 years, it looks like it flattens off or even decreases in terms of the marginal benefit.
I think just it's really crucial that the quality is there, because otherwise you may well have very high levels of access, but if the quality is very low and we've seen some statistics and some ratios, then there might actually be negative impact even before participation.
Yeah. And certainly
thank you.
Variations across countries. So we're drawing here on PISA data. So we asked 15-year-olds in the PISA study whether they participated in early childhood education care or not, and for how long, and so what age they entered. So there's some kind of question marks about how well do 15-year-olds remember that. But the patterns of the results seem pretty consistent, so we have some confidence. Of course, it's not answering every question we would have, but there are quite a lot of variations across countries, which would have to point to some countries probably have the components of early childhood ECEC, better established or better structured than others.
Okay. Well, thank you so much. I know that it's late in Paris and that our excellent presenters from the OECD need to get going. I'm not seeing any more questions, but before I close this out, I just want to express MCSL's deepest thanks to Rowan, Arno, and Elizabeth for joining us today and sharing these data and research. We're definitely learning a lot about early learning around the world, and this is very helpful, so thank you very much. For those of you who are on, if you want to view the slides from the first half of the presentation that got a little janky from the timer problem that we had, you're welcome to do so. You can just download a PDF straight out of the webinar application. If you have any questions for me at MCSL or for any of the folks at the OECD, you've got their contact information. Please feel welcome to reach out. We're always happy to help. I did hear maybe one more question.
Maddie, it's Rowena here from the OECD. I was saying I managed to turn off the transitions button. So the slides, if you want us to send through a version that isn't automatically progressing from slide to slide, I can do that. It was actually quite simple, so I do apologise once again for that.
Sure. I think we managed to get the transitions fixed on our side, but we just weren't able to upload them because of some network issues we were having. So all right. Well, thanks again, everyone. Have excellent Mondays and excellent weeks, and please do feel welcome to reach out if you have any questions.